The holographic display flickered with images of burning cities, while 12 alien voices argued in perfect harmony through the translation matrix. Rick Hayes watched from his restraint chair as footage of human wars played across the curved walls of the trial chamber. Every bomb explosion, every battlefield, every smoking ruin seemed to pulse with accusation. Species designation human shows consistent patterns of systematic violence, announced the lead prosecutor, a Lumari whose crystalline body refracted light into rainbow patterns. Observe the evidence from their own historical records. Rick wanted to object, to explain that the footage showed humanity's worst moments without context, but the neural dampener around his neck prevented him from speaking during the evidence presentation. He could only watch as the Galactic Council reviewed humanity's darkest chapters, while his crew remained locked in detention cells 3 levels below. The prosecution continued methodically. The Chitesh representative, resembling a massive mantis with golden carapace, clicked its mandibles rhythmically as it presented environmental data. They poisoned their own atmosphere with industrial waste. They cleared forests that took centuries to grow. They drove countless species to extinction through carelessness and greed. More images flashed across the chamber walls: strip mines, oil spills, melting ice caps. The assembled alien council members shifted uncomfortably in their specialized seats, designed to accommodate everything from the aquatic deep flow to the energy-based Solari. The final evidence, declared the prosecutor, shows their attempt to spread this destruction beyond their home world. Observe their colonial expansion patterns. Rick's heart sank as footage from Mars Colony 7 appeared. The failed terraforming project had indeed left scars across the red planet's surface. The abandoned mining operations on Europa looked like open wounds against the ice. Every human mistake seemed magnified under the chamber's harsh lighting. The neural dampener deactivated with a soft chime, allowing Rick to finally speak in his defense. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of his species' future pressing down on his shoulders. Honored council members, yes, we made mistakes. Every young species does, but you're seeing only part of the picture. Silence, commanded Council Prime, a being so ancient that his species' name was forgotten, existing now as pure thought within a mechanical shell. The evidence is conclusive. Humans represent a Class 5 extinction threat to all galactic life. The chamber filled with clicking, humming, and whistling as the council members discussed in their native languages. Rick caught fragments through the translator. Words like dangerous, uncontainable, and eliminate echoed from multiple directions. The sentence is exile, announced Council Prime after several minutes of deliberation. You have 72 standard hours to evacuate all humans from Earth. Orbital bombardment will commence after that deadline to ensure complete sterilization of the planet. Rick felt the blood drain from his face. You can't be serious. There are 8 billion people down there. Most don't even have access to space travel. We are not without mercy, replied the Lumari prosecutor. 3 worlds have been designated for human quarantine. Desert coordinates 847.3 by 219.7. Frost, coordinates 156.9 by 891.2. And storm, coordinates 432.1 by 675.8. These worlds will contain your species until natural extinction occurs. The holographic display shifted to show 3 planets that looked like nightmare versions of habitat worlds. Desert appeared as nothing but endless sand dunes under twin suns. Frost showed ice sheets kilometers thick with no visible liquid water. Storm displayed a world racked by perpetual hurricanes that never seemed to end. Those aren't quarantine worlds, Rick said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. Those are death sentences. You might as well execute us directly. The choice is yours, said Council Prime with mechanical indifference. Accept exile to the quarantine worlds or remain on Earth for orbital cleansing. Either way, the galaxy will be safe from human expansion. Rick looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives. Some avoided his gaze entirely. Others watched with what might have been curiosity or pity, though alien expressions were hard to read. The deep flow ambassador seemed agitated, water cycling rapidly through the filtration system of his environmental suit. I request permission to address the council, Rick said formally. Denied. The verdict is final. Then I have something to say anyway. Rick stepped forward, causing several security drones to activate their warning lights. You think you know humans because you've seen our wars and our mistakes, but you don't understand what drives us at all. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. We fight because we care. We make mistakes because we try things that have never been attempted. We damage our environment because we're learning how to live on a world that's trying to kill us every single day. Earth isn't some peaceful paradise that we corrupted. It's a hostile planet that forged us into survivors. Some of the council members leaned forward, though Rick couldn't tell if it was with interest or irritation. You want to put us on 3 death worlds and wait for us to die quietly. But here's what you don't understand about humans. Rick's voice grew stronger with each word. We don't die quietly. We adapt, we overcome. We turn the impossible into the inevitable. Your species' arrogance knows no bounds, clicked the Chitesh representative. These quarantine worlds will break even your stubborn will to survive. Maybe, Rick admitted. But I doubt it. Give us 5 years on those worlds you think will kill us. 5 years. And then send your observers to see what we've done with them. Council Prime's mechanical voice carried a note of what might have been amusement. You believe you can survive on worlds specifically chosen for their hostility to human life? I believe we can do more than survive. I believe we can thrive. And I believe that when you see what we've accomplished, you'll realize you made the biggest mistake in galactic history. The silence stretched for several seconds before Council Prime spoke again. The sentence stands. 72 hours. Choose your quarantine worlds wisely, human. They will be your species' final resting place. As the security drones escorted Rick from the chamber, he heard whispered conversations starting among the council members. Some sounded worried. Others seemed curious. A few carried notes of what might have been hope. Rick smiled grimly as the chamber doors sealed behind him. The aliens thought they were ending humanity's story. Instead, they had just given humans the greatest challenge in their species' history. And if there was one thing humans had always been good at, it was rising to meet impossible challenges. The countdown to evacuation had begun. News of the galactic ultimatum reached Earth through every communication channel simultaneously, creating a cascade of information that rippled across the planet in minutes rather than hours. Amy Foster was debugging protein sequences in her laboratory when her assistant burst through the door with tears streaming down his face. "Doctor, you need to see this right now," he said, activating the wall display without waiting for permission. The image showed Rick Hayes standing before a crowd of reporters outside the United Nations building. His face carried the weight of impossible news, but his voice remained steady as he spoke. The Galactic Council has given humanity 72 hours to evacuate Earth completely. Failure to comply will result in orbital bombardment of our planet. Amy's first thought was that someone was playing an elaborate prank. Her second thought, as she watched government officials nodding grimly behind Rick, was that the prank was too elaborate to be fake. Her third thought was purely scientific. How does an entire species evacuate a planet in 3 days? The answer, it turned out, was that they didn't panic first. Amy had expected riots, looting, and complete social breakdown within hours of the announcement. Instead, something remarkable happened. People started organizing. Social media filled with logistics discussions rather than despair. Engineers shared spacecraft designs. Doctors compiled medical supplies lists. Teachers began planning educational systems for wherever humanity ended up. It's like the entire species just activated some kind of emergency protocol. Her assistant observed 3 hours after the announcement. Look at this. The displays now showed massive coordination efforts across every major city. Cargo ships were being retrofitted as passenger vessels. Military transports prepared for civilian evacuation. Most surprisingly, the 3 quarantine worlds had been divided up not by nations or governments, but by volunteer specialization groups. Desert attracted engineers, geologists, and solar energy experts who saw the twin suns as a power source rather than a threat. Frost drew cryogenic specialists, underground construction teams, and anyone with experience in extreme cold environments. Storm appealed to meteorologists, wind energy engineers, and floating platform designers who viewed perpetual hurricanes as an engineering challenge. Amy found herself assigned to desert almost automatically. Her expertise in extremophile bacteria and protein adaptation made her invaluable for survival in high-temperature environments. She packed her research data, her equipment, and her hopes into 3 regulation storage containers. The evacuation itself defied every disaster movie ever made. Instead of chaos, there was an eerie calm efficiency. Families said goodbye to their homes with the same methodical approach they used for moving to a new city. Children asked practical questions about their new worlds rather than crying about leaving. Earth. The elderly shared stories about previous challenges humanity had overcome while packing their most precious possessions. General David Park coordinated the military aspects of the evacuation, but found himself managing logistics rather than crowd control. "I've never seen anything like this," he told Amy during a brief meeting at the staging area. "We prepared for panic, riots, people fighting each other for seats on the evacuation ships. Instead, everyone's working together like we're moving house rather than abandoning our planet." The first wave of evacuees reached desert 6 hours ahead of schedule. Amy watched through the viewport as the planet grew larger, twin suns creating a harsh glare that forced everyone to look away. The surface appeared to be nothing but endless dunes with no visible water, vegetation, or shelter. "Looks friendly," muttered someone behind her with dry humor that somehow made everyone feel better. The landing was rougher than expected, but the colonization equipment survived intact. As Amy stepped onto desert's surface for the first time, the heat hit her like opening an oven door. The sand beneath her feet felt hot enough to cook food. The air shimmered with thermals that made distance impossible to judge. "Well," she said to the other scientists gathering around her, "at least we won't have to worry about staying warm." Within hours, the first solar collection arrays were operational, not the primitive panels they had used on Earth, but sophisticated systems designed to work with desert's unique dual-star system. The engineering teams had spent the entire evacuation journey redesigning their equipment to take advantage of the planet's harsh conditions rather than simply survive them. By the end of the first week, desert's human population had established 3 base camps positioned to take advantage of the thermal dynamics created by the twin suns. Amy's biological research team discovered that the planet wasn't sterile as initially thought, but hosted extremophile organisms that thrived in the intense heat. "These bacteria could be the key to everything," she explained to General Park during their weekly progress report. "They've evolved to process minerals directly from the sand and use thermal energy instead of chemical energy for metabolism. If we can adapt their processes, we might be able to create a sustainable ecosystem here." Similar reports arrived from Frost and Storm. The Ice World teams had discovered vast underground thermal networks that kept the planet's core warm despite the frozen surface. Storm's floating platform. Prototypes had successfully harnessed the perpetual hurricane winds to generate more electrical power than entire cities on Earth consumed. The most surprising development came 3 months after evacuation. A Lumari monitoring station detected unusual energy signatures from all 3 quarantine worlds. Instead of the declining power outputs expected from dying colonies, the readings showed increasing energy production and expanding infrastructure. "Impossible," declared the station commander. A crystalline being whose body normally refracted light in calm blue patterns but now showed agitated red and orange hues. The quarantine worlds were specifically chosen to be uninhabitable by carbon-based life forms. The monitoring data told a different story. Desert showed massive solar collection arrays connected to underground cooling systems that made habitation possible in the deep sand layers. Frost displayed geothermal tapping operations that created warm zones beneath the ice where ecosystems could develop. Storm revealed floating cities that rode the hurricane winds like surfers riding waves, generating power from the very storms that were supposed to destroy them. "Send a reconnaissance probe," ordered the station commander. "We need to see what these humans are actually doing." The probe's footage reached the Galactic Council 3 days later. Instead of struggling survivors eking out a desperate existence, the images showed thriving communities that seemed to be enjoying their new worlds. Children played in underground gardens on desert. Scientists conducted experiments in ice crystal, laboratories on Frost. Artists created wind sculptures on Storm that changed shape. With the perpetual storms, they're not dying, observed Council Prime with mechanical puzzlement. They appear to be adapting. The Lumari prosecutor studied the probe data with growing unease. Perhaps we underestimated their resilience, but surely they cannot maintain this level of activity indefinitely. The quarantine worlds will break them eventually. But as the months passed, the monitoring stations recorded not decline, but growth. Trade routes began appearing between the 3 worlds. Communication networks expanded. Most troubling of all, energy signatures suggested the humans were not just surviving their harsh environments, but transforming them. "What have we done?" whispered a Deep Flow Council member during a closed session 6 months after the evacuation. The question would haunt the Galactic Council for years to come, though they didn't know it yet. On 3 worlds they had chosen as graveyards, humanity was writing the opening chapters of a story that would reshape the galaxy. 3 years after exile, desert bloomed. Amy Foster stood in the observation dome of New Sahara Station, watching children play in gardens that shouldn't exist while their parents tended to crops that thrived in 130-degree heat. The transformation still amazed her, even though she had helped engineer every step of it. "The thermal bacteria exceeded all our projections again this month," reported her research partner while updating the daily status board. "They're not just processing sand into soil anymore. They're creating complex nutrient chains that support Earth-origin plants." Through the dome's specially treated glass, Amy could see the evidence spreading in all directions. What had once been endless dunes now showed patches of green that grew larger each day. The plants weren't struggling against desert's heat. They were thriving in it thanks to genetic modifications based on the native extremophile organisms. "Any word from Frost or Storm?" Amy asked, though she already knew the answer from her assistant's excited expression. "Storm just launched their 15th floating city. They're calling this one Windrise, and it's completely self-sustaining. Frost reported another breakthrough in their underground ecosystem project. They've got entire forests growing in their thermal caves now." Amy nodded, unsurprised. Each quarantine world had developed along the path of least resistance, working with their environments instead of against them. Desert became humanity's solar energy capital, generating enough power to support not just the growing colony but also manufacturing facilities that produced goods for trade with the other worlds. The communication system chimed with an incoming priority message from Admiral Rick Hayes, who now commanded a small fleet of ships built in the orbital shipyards above Storm. His weathered face appeared on the display, but his eyes held a vitality that hadn't been there during the trial 3 years ago. "Amy, we've got an interesting situation developing," Rick said without preamble. "Long-range sensors are picking up a distress signal from a Lumari transport ship. Looks like they're dealing with some kind of plague that's wiping out their colony." Amy felt her scientific curiosity spark immediately. What kind of plague? Biological, viral, energy-based? Unknown. But here's the interesting part. They're not asking for help from the Galactic Council. They're broadcasting on open channels, hoping anyone will respond. Our linguists think they might be refugees from one of the inner systems. The implications hit Amy immediately. For 3 years, humanity had been completely isolated from galactic society. No trade, no communication, no contact except for the occasional monitoring probe that observed from a distance. If refugees were approaching human space, it meant the galaxy wasn't as unified as the Council pretended. "What do you want to do?" Amy asked, though she already knew Rick's answer. "Help them. Storm has medical facilities that could handle biological containments. Desert has research capabilities that could analyze unknown pathogens. And Frost has isolation chambers if we need to quarantine patients." Amy smiled. "So we're going to save members of the same species that sentenced us to death?" "Amy, we're going to do what humans do. We're going to help people who need help." The Lumari transport arrived at Desert 6 hours later, its crystalline hull dulled by some kind of contamination that made the normally beautiful refractive surfaces appear cloudy and sick. Amy met the ship personally, wearing full environmental protection but projecting calm confidence through her body language. The Lumari captain, a being whose crystal structure showed deep stress fractures, communicated through desperate light pulses that the translation system barely managed to interpret. Their colony had been struck by a bacterial plague that seemed specifically designed to attack crystalline life forms. Standard galactic medical treatments had failed completely. "We were told humans were dangerous," the captain managed to say through the translator. "But you are our last hope. The Council worlds have quarantined us. They fear the plague will spread to their populations." Amy spent the next 48 hours working with samples from the infected Lumari, assisted by researchers on Storm and Frost through quantum communication links. The plague was indeed sophisticated, but it shared characteristics with extremophile organisms she had studied extensively on Desert. "It's not a weapon," she explained to Rick during one of their progress conferences. "It's a natural organism that probably evolved in high-energy environments. The Lumari must have encountered it during deep space exploration and brought it back to their colony world." "Can you cure it?" Better than that, I think we can immunize against it. The treatment worked beyond Amy's most optimistic projections. Not only did it cure the infected Lumari, but it actually strengthened their crystalline structures, making them more resilient against similar pathogens. The refugees were so grateful that they asked permission to establish a permanent research station on Desert, contributing their expertise in crystal-based technology to human projects. Word of humanity's medical miracle spread through unofficial channels across the galaxy. Within weeks, other refugee groups began arriving at the quarantine worlds. Chitesh miners fleeing corporate exploitation found sanctuary on Frost, where human geothermal engineers shared techniques for sustainable underground operations. Deep flow artists escaping political persecution discovered that Storm's floating cities could accommodate aquatic environments perfectly. We're becoming a haven for everyone the galaxy doesn't want, Rick observed during a council meeting between the three world governors. That's not a problem, replied General Park, who now served as Frost's administrator. It's an opportunity. Look what these refugees are bringing us. The contributions were remarkable. Lumari crystal technology revolutionized human solar collectors, increasing efficiency by 300%. Chitesh mining expertise opened up mineral resources on all three worlds that humans had never discovered. Deep flow aquaculture techniques created food production systems that worked perfectly in Desert's underground water networks. More importantly, the refugees brought stories about the galaxy beyond the quarantine zones. The Galactic Council's authority was fracturing. Several species were reconsidering their membership after witnessing the treatment of humanity and other refugee groups. Trade disputes were escalating into armed conflicts. Resource shortages plagued many core worlds. Meanwhile, Amy told her assembled research staff during their weekly progress meeting, we're sitting on three worlds that are becoming the most prosperous and peaceful regions in known space. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The quarantine worlds, chosen specifically to kill humanity slowly, had become beacons of cooperation and innovation. Species that had never worked together were collaborating on projects that benefited everyone. Technologies were being shared freely instead of hoarded behind corporate barriers. The council made a mistake, said one of the Lumari researchers during a joint project meeting. They thought isolation would weaken you. Instead, it freed you from their limitations. Amy pondered this observation while reviewing the latest progress reports. Desert now hosted research facilities from 6 different species. Frost had become a neutral meeting ground where former enemies worked together on engineering projects. Storm's floating cities were cultural melting pots where art and music from dozens of worlds blended into something entirely new. Maybe, she said to her reflection in the laboratory window, that was always the point. 3 months later, the first official trade delegation arrived from the Outer Rim worlds. They weren't seeking permission from the Galactic Council. They were coming directly to humanity with offers of partnership and mutual benefit. Rick met them personally, no longer as a condemned prisoner, but as the de facto leader of the most successful multi-species cooperation project in galactic history. As he welcomed the delegation to Desert's primary spaceport, he couldn't help but remember his words to the Council 3 years ago. Give us 5 years, he had said, and we'll show you what we're really made of. They were ahead of schedule. Representative Qual of the Deep Flow had never violated protocol in 3 centuries of diplomatic service, but desperation drove beings to extraordinary measures. His aquatic environmental suit felt heavier than usual as he approached the security checkpoint for Storm, the hurricane-lashed world that was supposed to have killed every human within months of their arrival. Purpose of visit? Asked the human security officer with professional courtesy that surprised Qual. He had expected suspicion or hostility from members of a species the galaxy had condemned to death. Cultural exchange, Qual replied through his translator, which was technically true. He was here to understand human culture, though not for the reasons stated in his falsified travel documents. The transport to Storm's primary floating city took 2 hours through winds that would have shattered most galactic vessels. Qual watched in growing amazement as their shuttle rode the hurricane currents like a leaf on water, its design clearly inspired by principles that worked with the storms rather than against them. First time to Storm? Asked his human escort, a woman named Beth whose casual demeanor seemed inappropriate for someone living on what the Galactic Council had classified as a Class A death world. Yes, Qual admitted. I was told it was uninhabitable, Beth laughed, a sound that translated as positive amusement rather than mockery. That's what everyone thought. Turned out the storms are the best thing about this place? Unlimited energy, natural transportation currents, and weather patterns that are totally predictable once you understand the math. The primary city of Stormhaven exceeded every expectation Qual had formed during his secret journey. Instead of desperate survivors huddling in shelters, he found a thriving metropolis that seemed to dance with the eternal hurricanes. Buildings swayed gracefully with the wind loads, their flexible architecture incorporating design principles from a dozen different species. Your accommodations, Beth explained as they entered a tower that rose into the storm clouds, include full aquatic environmental controls. We've hosted deep flow visitors before, so we know what you need to be comfortable. Qual's suite was a marvel of interspecies engineering. The main living area maintained standard atmospheric conditions, but his private chambers were flooded with water that matched the salinity and temperature of his homeworld perfectly. Bioluminescent decorations created lighting patterns that reminded him of deep ocean environments. How did you know? He asked Beth, genuinely puzzled. The Deep Flow had never shared their specific environmental requirements with human authorities. Research, she replied simply. We make it our business to understand what every species needs to feel at home. That's kind of our thing now. Over the following days, Qual explored Stormhaven with growing disbelief. The city wasn't just surviving the perpetual hurricanes, it was thriving because of them. Wind generators produced more energy than the entire Deep Flow homeworld consumed. Transportation systems used air currents to move people and cargo efficiently between platforms. Most remarkably, the storms themselves were being gradually modified through atmospheric engineering techniques that actually strengthened the weather patterns while making them more predictable. We're not fighting the environment, explained the lead meteorologist. During Qual's tour of the Weather Control Center, we're becoming part of it. The hurricanes are like organs in a vast atmospheric body. We just learned how to work with them instead of against them. But the technology was only part of what amazed Qual. The social integration was unprecedented. Chitesh engineers worked alongside human architects on building projects that incorporated both species' design philosophies. Lumari artists created crystal sculptures that captured and refracted the stormlight into patterns that told stories from multiple cultures. Deep flow aquaculturists had established floating kelp farms in the lower atmosphere that produced food and oxygen simultaneously. This shouldn't be possible, Qual confided to his journal during his third evening on Storm. The Galactic Council specifically chose these worlds because they would prevent human expansion and force gradual extinction. Instead, they've created something that makes our core worlds look primitive. The revelation that changed everything came during his visit to the Cultural Center, a massive floating structure that served as a meeting place for all the species now living in human space. Qual had expected to find human dominance over the refugee populations. Instead, he discovered something that violated everything he thought he knew about interspecies relations. Humans were the minority. We're actually outnumbered now, admitted Susan Ward, the human ambassador who had volunteered to answer Qual's questions. About 40% of Storm's population is human. The rest are refugees, researchers, traders, and settlers from other species who came here voluntarily. But you're still in charge, Qual stated, seeking confirmation of what seemed obvious. Susan shook her head. Nobody's in charge the way you mean it. We make decisions by consensus, with each species contributing their expertise to problems they understand best. Humans handle atmospheric engineering because we've learned how to work with storms. Chitesh manage mining operations because they understand mineral extraction. Lumari oversee energy systems because they've mastered crystal technology. Qual struggled to process this information. But surely humans maintain military control. Political authority? Economic dominance? Why would we want those things? Susan asked, seeming genuinely puzzled. Control creates resistance. Authority breeds resentment. Dominance generates rebellion. We learned a long time ago that cooperation produces better results than coercion. That evening, Qual attended what humans called a cultural fusion festival, expecting to see token displays of alien traditions under human oversight. Instead, he witnessed something unprecedented, genuine collaborative art forms that couldn't have been created by any single species alone. Deep flow water dancers performed in floating aquatic spheres, while Lumari light artists created crystalline accompaniment and human musicians provided rhythmic foundations that enhanced both performances without overwhelming them. The result was neither human nor alien, but something entirely new that celebrated the unique contributions of all participants. "We call it synthesis culture," explained one of the human artists. "Not replacement, not assimilation, not dominance. Just different traditions coming together to create something none of us could make alone." Qual's secret mission had been to assess human military capabilities and potential threats to galactic security. Instead, he found himself compiling a very different kind of report. During his final days on Storm, humans have developed 3 worlds into the most successful interspecies colonies in recorded galactic history, he wrote in his encrypted files. Their approach challenges fundamental assumptions about resource competition, territorial control, and species hierarchy. Rather than dominating other cultures, they have created frameworks that allow each species to contribute their strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. The most troubling revelation came when Susan presented him with a gift during his departure ceremony, a bound document titled The Galactic Travel Guide to Human Space, Where Every Species Finds Home. "We've been working on this for 2 years, she explained, as Qual examined the comprehensive guide. It started as documentation for refugees about how to adapt to life on our worlds, but it evolved into something bigger. It's become a blueprint for interspecies cooperation. The guide contained detailed information about how each quarantine world had been modified to accommodate the biological and cultural needs of different species. More importantly, it outlined principles and techniques that could be applied anywhere in the galaxy to create similar cooperative communities." "You're sharing this freely?" Qual asked, knowing that such information would be worth fortunes to the right buyers. "Of course, why wouldn't we? The more species that learn to work together, the better off everyone becomes." As Qual's transport lifted off from Stormhaven, he watched the floating city recede into the hurricane winds that had been meant to destroy it. Instead of destruction, he had witnessed creation. Instead of extinction, he had seen evolution. Instead of human expansion through conquest, he had observed growth through invitation. His report to the Deep Flow government would trigger crisis meetings across multiple star systems. The Galactic Council had created something they never intended, a living example that their entire philosophy of species relations was not only wrong, but actively harmful to galactic prosperity. The quarantine worlds had become something unprecedented in galactic history. They had become what every world could be, if other species had the courage to learn from humanity's example. But courage, Qual reflected as he began composing his report, had never been the Galactic Council's strongest characteristic. The first star died on a Tuesday. Admiral Rick Hayes was reviewing supply manifests in his office aboard the orbital station above Storm when the emergency alert systems activated throughout human space. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a sector map with a red void where the Kepler system had existed for billions of years. "Gone," reported communications officer Lisa from the primary console. "Not destroyed, not damaged, just gone, like it was never there." Rick studied the sensor data streaming across multiple displays. Energy readings showed impossible spikes followed by complete absence. Matter detectors found nothing but empty space where 4 planets and a G-class star should have existed. Most disturbing of all, the gravitational effects that should have persisted even after stellar destruction were completely absent. "Get me Admiral Park on Frost and Director Foster on Desert," Rick ordered. "Priority channel, immediate response." Within minutes, the 3 leaders of humanity's exile worlds were connected through quantum communication links. General Park's weathered face showed the strain of 4 years governing a world of underground cities, while Amy's excitement about her latest research had been replaced by scientific concern. "Please tell me you have theories," Rick said without preamble, forwarding the censored data to both locations. Amy's response came first. "Energy absorption on this scale shouldn't be possible according to any physics we understand. Something consumed an entire solar system's mass and converted it to pure energy without leaving residual matter or gravitational effects." "Any ideas what could do that?" Park asked. "None that I want to consider," Amy replied grimly. The answer came 6 hours later when long-range sensors detected the approaching energy signatures, 12 entities that barely registered on conventional instruments, but showed up clearly on quantum resonance scanners. They moved through space without apparent propulsion, consuming stellar matter as they traveled. Void Hunters, announced Council Prime during an emergency galactic broadcast that reached human space despite the supposed quarantine. Ancient legends speak of beings that devoured stars in the dark times before galactic civilization. We believed them extinct for 50,000 years. Rick watched the Council's broadcast with growing alarm as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The Void Hunters weren't random destroyers. They followed specific patterns, targeting systems with high energy output first and working systematically through each sector. At their current rate of consumption, they would reach the galactic core within 2 months. Galactic defense forces are mobilizing, continued Council Prime. All member species are required to contribute military resources for immediate deployment to threatened systems. The communication ended abruptly, leaving Rick staring at tactical displays that showed the magnitude of the crisis. The Galactic Council's combined fleets included thousands of warships equipped with weapons that could crack planets. Against the Void Hunters, they lasted an average of 17 minutes before complete annihilation. "Sir," Lisa called from her station, "we're receiving a priority message from Galactic Command. They're requesting immediate military assistance from human forces." Rick almost laughed. "They want help from the species they sentenced to extinction?" The message includes authorization codes that would lift the quarantine restrictions and restore full galactic citizenship in exchange for military cooperation. The irony was overwhelming. 4 years ago, the Council had declared humanity too dangerous to exist. Now they were begging for help from the same supposedly violent species they had tried to eliminate. "Prepare a response," Rick ordered. "Tell them we'll help, but not the way they expect." The human response fleet that departed for Void Hunter territory 3 days later looked nothing like a traditional military force. Instead of weapons-laden battleships, they brought research vessels, communication arrays, and equipment designed for deep space exploration rather than combat. Amy accompanied the fleet personally, along with research teams from all 3 quarantine worlds. As they approached the first active consumption zone, she studied the Void Hunters through every sensor array available to human science. "They're not malevolent," she announced during the fleet's strategy meeting. "They're starving." Rick leaned forward in his command chair. "Explain. Look at their energy patterns. They're not consuming matter because they want to destroy civilizations. They're consuming it because they need the energy to survive. These are refugees from somewhere else, probably another universe where their normal energy sources are no longer available." The revelation changed everything. While galactic defense forces continued their futile attacks on the Void Hunters, human researchers worked on a completely different approach. Instead of trying to destroy the entities, they attempted to communicate with them. The breakthrough came from Storm's communication specialists, who had developed translation protocols for the dozens of species now living in human space. They discovered that the Void Hunters communicated through quantum fluctuations in space-time itself, using the fabric of reality as their medium. "They're trying to tell us something," reported the lead linguist during an emergency conference call between all human worlds. "The translations are rough, but they seem to be apologizing for the destruction they're causing." Amy worked around the clock with her research teams to decode the Void Hunter language patterns. The story that emerged was both tragic and terrifying. The entities were indeed refugees from a dying universe where the fundamental forces had begun breaking down. They had escaped through dimensional barriers that required enormous energy to traverse, arriving in this universe already weakened and desperate. "They're not trying to destroy us," Amy explained to Rick during a private consultation. "They're trying to survive long enough to find a new home, but they don't understand that the energy they need to live is the same energy that powers our civilizations. Can we help them without letting them kill everyone in the galaxy? I think so. But it's going to require cooperation on a scale that the galaxy has never seen before." Amy's solution was elegantly simple in concept, but staggeringly complex in execution. Instead of fighting the Void Hunters or trying to satisfy their energy needs with existing stellar systems, humanity would create artificial stars specifically designed to provide the type of energy the entities required. The project required resources and expertise from every species in human space. Lumari crystal technology formed the core containment systems. Chitesh mining operations provided exotic materials from stellar cores. Deep flow aquaculture techniques were adapted to manage the plasma flows required for artificial stellar ignition. Human engineering integrated all the components into a working system. Most importantly, the project required the cooperation of species that had been enemies for centuries. The artificial star construction sites became neutral zones where former adversaries worked together toward a common goal that benefited everyone. This is impossible, declared the Galactic Council, representative who arrived to observe the project. You cannot create stable artificial stars without destroying yourselves in the process. Amy smiled as she showed the representative the first successful test ignition. The artificial star blazed with clean, controlled fusion that provided exactly the energy spectrum the void hunters needed without the gravitational effects that made natural stars unsuitable for civilization. You keep saying things are impossible, she replied. We keep proving you wrong. The first artificial star went online 6 weeks after the project began. The nearest void hunter approached cautiously, then settled into a stable orbit around the new energy source. Within hours, its consumption of natural stellar systems ceased completely. Over the following months, human-led teams constructed artificial stars throughout void hunter territory. Each new energy source reduced the pressure on natural systems and allowed the entities to establish permanent settlements, rather than constantly wandering in search of sustenance. The project's success exceeded every projection. Not only did it solve the void hunter crisis, but it also created the most extensive interspecies cooperation network in galactic history. Trade routes established to support the artificial star construction became permanent commercial relationships. Research alliances formed to study the new technology led to breakthrough discoveries in dozens of fields. They wanted to exile us because we were too dangerous, Rick observed as he watched the final artificial star come online. Instead, they gave us the opportunity to save the galaxy. The Void Hunters, no longer desperate and starving, proved to be surprisingly peaceful neighbors. Their understanding of dimensional physics opened new frontiers for exploration. Their gratitude for humanity's assistance created diplomatic relationships that bypassed the traditional galactic power structures completely. 6 months after the crisis began, representatives from 43 species attended a conference on Desert to establish formal cooperation agreements. The Galactic Council was notably absent, having been effectively bypassed by the new alliance networks that had formed around human-led initiatives. "You realize what you've done?" asked Qual during the conference closing ceremonies. The Deep Flow representative had become an unofficial ambassador between the old galactic order and the new cooperative networks. Rick nodded slowly. "We've shown the galaxy what's possible when species work together instead of competing for dominance." "More than that," Qual replied. "You've made the old ways obsolete. The Council's authority was based on controlling resources and mediating conflicts. You've created abundance and eliminated the sources of most conflicts." As Rick looked out over the mixed crowd of humans and aliens celebrating their shared achievements, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 4 years ago, they had been condemned as a threat to galactic civilization. Now they were the architects of a new form of civilization that included everyone. The quarantine was about to end, but not because humanity had served their sentence. It was ending because the galaxy had learned there were better ways to live than the ones that had required quarantine in the first place. 5 years to the day after his species' exile began, Rick Hayes walked through the corridors of Concordia Station as a free man. The massive Galactic Council chamber looked smaller than he remembered, its curved walls no longer seeming to press down with the weight of impossible judgment. This time, he carried a leather-bound book under his arm instead of wearing restraint shackles around his neck. "The session will come to order," announced Council Prime, though his mechanical voice lacked the authority it had once commanded. The chamber was fuller than Rick remembered, with representatives from dozens of species that hadn't been present during humanity's trial. Many wore the distinctive cooperation symbols that had become common throughout what people now called the Human Alliance worlds. "Admiral Hayes," said the Lumari representative, whose crystalline body now refracted light in patterns that indicated respect rather than hostility. "We gathered today to formally discuss the termination of humanity's quarantine status." Rick almost smiled at the understatement. The quarantine had become meaningless months ago. when trade routes through human space carried more galactic commerce than the traditional core world networks. Formal diplomatic relationships existed between human worlds and 43 different species, most of whom had never been part of the original Galactic Council. Before we proceed with official matters, Rick said, placing the book on the speaker's podium, I'd like to present something to the Council. He opened the leather binding to reveal pages filled with detailed information, star charts, cultural guides, and practical advice. The title page read, The Galactic Travel Guide to Human Space, Where Every Species Finds Home, 3rd edition. This started as a simple reference manual for refugees seeking shelter on our quarantine worlds, Rick explained as holographic displays showed pages from the guide. It grew into something more comprehensive as we learned how to make our worlds welcoming to different forms of life. Council Prime's mechanical sensors focused on the projected images. This appears to be a tourist guide. In a way it is. But it's also a blueprint for interspecies cooperation, a technical manual for environmental adaptation, and a cultural exchange handbook all in one document. Rick activated a series of holographic displays that showed the current state of the 3 quarantine worlds. Desert now bloomed with ecosystems that supported dozens of species simultaneously, its solar collection arrays powering research facilities that advanced galactic science by decades each year. Frost had become a neutral meeting ground where former enemies worked together on projects too complex for any single species to handle alone. Storm's floating cities had evolved into cultural centers where art, music, and literature from across the galaxy blended into new forms of expression. These worlds were chosen to kill us, Rick continued, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. Instead, they became the foundation for a new way of living. The guide documents not just how to visit these places, but how to recreate their success anywhere in the galaxy. He turned to a section showing population statistics. Desert currently hosts permanent residents from 26 different species. Frost has communities from 31 species. Storm houses representatives from 38 different cultures. None of them are there because they were forced to be. They're there because they chose to be. The Shitesh representative clicked its mandibles in what Rick had learned was curiosity rather than aggression. You claim these species coexist without conflict? Not without disagreements, Rick admitted. But we've developed systems for resolving conflicts that strengthen communities instead of dividing them. When the Thermari colonists on Desert disagreed with the Coldreach engineers about water usage, they worked together to design systems that met both species' needs better than either original proposal. More displays showed infrastructure projects that seemed impossible by traditional galactic standards. Transportation systems that accommodated beings who flew, swam, crawled, or existed as pure energy. Agriculture that produced food suitable for species with completely different nutritional requirements. Architecture that provided comfortable environments for life forms that evolved under different atmospheric pressures, gravity levels, and temperature ranges. The guide isn't just about visiting our worlds, Rick explained. It's about transforming your own worlds using the same principles. Every technique, every innovation, every solution is documented and freely shared. Freely shared? Asked the Deep Flow representative with obvious skepticism. You expect no compensation for this information? The compensation is living in a galaxy where every species can thrive instead of merely survive. Rick turned to the final section of the guide, which contained the most revolutionary information. Detailed technical specifications for artificial star construction, dimensional physics research that came from working with the Void Hunters, and social frameworks that had allowed dozens of species to cooperate on projects that benefited everyone involved. The old galactic order was based on scarcity, he said, looking directly at Council Prime. Competition for limited resources, control of territory and trade routes, fear that helping others meant weakening yourself. We've proven that cooperation creates abundance, that diversity generates strength, and that helping others actually helps yourself. The chamber erupted in multilingual discussions as representatives debated among themselves in their native languages. Rick waited patiently while translation systems worked to process dozens of simultaneous conversations. This is all very impressive, Council Prime said after several minutes of chaos, but it does not address the fundamental concerns that led to humanity's exile. You remain a violent and expansionist species. Rick had expected this objection. Let me ask you something, Council Prime. When was the last time humans initiated military action against another species? Your conflict with the Void Hunters occurred less than 1 year ago. That wasn't a conflict. That was a rescue operation. We saved the Void Hunters from starvation and the galaxy from destruction. No shots were fired. No beings were killed. We solved the problem through engineering and diplomacy. He activated another display showing current military statistics. Human space maintains defensive capabilities, but we haven't used them offensively since our exile began. Meanwhile, how many wars have been fought between Council member species during the same period? The silence that followed answered Rick's question more clearly than words could have. The quarantine didn't change humanity, Rick continued. It freed us to become what we always had the potential to be. When you removed the competitive pressures of galactic politics, we discovered that cooperation produces better results than conflict. Amy Foster's voice joined the conversation through a quantum communication link from Desert. The real revelation isn't that humans can cooperate. It's that every species can cooperate when the systems support it, instead of discouraging it. Her image appeared on the chamber's main display, with data from the ongoing research projects visible behind her. We've documented the process completely. Any species, any world, any civilization can implement these cooperation frameworks. The only requirement is the willingness to treat other species as partners rather than competitors. And if they refuse? Asked the Chitesh representative. If some species prefer the old ways of competition and territorial control? Rick smiled. Then they're welcome to continue using the old ways. But they'll find themselves increasingly isolated as more species discover the benefits of cooperation. The artificial star networks, the research alliances, the trade partnerships, these all function outside the traditional galactic authority structures. The implication was clear. The Galactic Council's power had been based on controlling access to resources and mediating conflicts between species. The human alliance worlds had eliminated resource scarcity through technology and prevented conflicts through social innovation. The Council's authority was rapidly becoming irrelevant. What do you propose? Asked Council Prime after another long pause. Rick closed the travel guide and looked around the chamber at representatives from species that had once sentenced his people to death. I propose that we stop pretending the quarantine still exists. Formal recognition of what already is. The 3 quarantine worlds have become the de facto galactic capital for cooperative species. Trade, diplomacy, research, and cultural exchange all flow through human space now. And Earth? Asked the Lumari representative quietly. Rick's smile broadened. Earth has been ready for visitors for over a year. We've been terraforming it not back to what it was, but forward to what it could be. A world that can support all galactic life forms simultaneously. We'd like to invite everyone to see it. He placed the travel guide back on the podium and stepped back. The age of quarantine is over. The age of invitation has begun. This guide is just the first step toward a galaxy where every species has a home wherever they choose to make it. As Rick left the chamber, he could hear the debates beginning behind him. Some species would resist the changes, clinging to old ways of thinking about territory and resources. Others would embrace the new possibilities immediately. But the choice was no longer in the hands of councils or governments. Individual beings from across the galaxy were already voting with their actions, choosing cooperation over competition, choosing abundance over scarcity, choosing welcome over fear. The human travel guide would soon be translated into hundreds of languages and distributed to every world that wanted it. The quarantine worlds would continue expanding their populations and their innovations, and Earth would once again welcome visitors, this time from across the galaxy. Humanity had been exiled as a threat to galactic civilization. They were returning as its salvation. The galaxy was about to become a much larger and more welcoming place.